They eventually reach a moment they never imagined possible. You stop caring. You stop chasing after them. You stop explaining yourself. You stop fighting to save the relationship. That realization does not bring them relief. Instead, it often creates intense panic. Rather than quietly accepting that you have moved on, their behavior becomes unpredictable. Their emotions begin to spiral, and before long, they turn to the most carefully planned strategy they still have available. What makes this final move so dangerous is that it rarely looks like manipulation. On the surface, it may seem like real change, sincere regret, overwhelming affection, or even a sudden personal crisis that appears to need your support. But beneath that carefully presented image is a completely different motive. Understanding this pattern can save you months or even years of emotional confusion and repeated heartbreak. Stay with me because what happens next explains why so many people get pulled back into the same painful cycle. If this message speaks to your experience, take a moment to support the channel by liking this video so more people can recognize these behaviors before becoming trapped by them. I would also love to hear your story in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's entire personality seem to change the instant they realized they were losing control over you? That moment reveals far more than most people expect. The instant a narcissistic person feels their emotional hold on you beginning to disappear, something changes inside them. This reaction is not driven by genuine love, real longing, or an honest desire to rebuild the relationship. It is powered by the fear of losing the control they believed they had over your emotions. For someone with strong narcissistic patterns, emotional control is incredibly important. They do not simply seek your attention. They depend on your emotional reactions, your frustration, your guilt, your efforts to defend yourself, your endless explanations, and even your confusion all become forms of emotional validation for them. Every response reassures them that they still have influence in your life. But everything begins to change when you become emotionally unavailable. When you stop arguing, stop defending yourself, and stop allowing their behavior to steal your peace, they experience something that feels like a deep psychological shock. The image of superiority they worked so hard to maintain begins to crack. In their mind, you were never supposed to emotionally walk away. They believed you would always remain connected somehow, whether through hope, fear, guilt, obligation, or unfinished feelings. They expected that regardless of what happened, they could always pull you back into the cycle. But when that emotional bond finally breaks, they are forced to face one of their greatest fears. They fear becoming irrelevant. Keep watching, because this is where everything starts to make sense. To a narcissistic person, becoming irrelevant feels like losing their importance. It threatens the identity they have built around being the center of someone else's emotional world. Your emotional distance sends a message they find extremely difficult to accept. It tells them that their manipulation no longer works. Their games no longer affect you. Their attempts to control your emotions have lost their power. That is why their behavior often becomes confusing and inconsistent. One day they may explode with anger. The next day they may appear desperate to fix everything. They may disappear without any warning, only to suddenly return with apologies, affection, emotional messages, or dramatic promises that they have completely changed. At other times, they may try to make you jealous, seek revenge, or create situations designed to get a reaction from you. Even though these behaviors look very different on the surface, they all come from the same goal. They want you to feel something again. It does not matter whether that feeling is love, anger, guilt, sadness, disappointment, or hope. As long as you remain emotionally invested, they still have a connection they can influence. The one thing that truly threatens them is not your hatred. It is your indifference. Emotional detachment is the one response they cannot easily control. They can take advantage of your empathy. They can use your guilt against you. They can feed on your need to explain yourself or your desire to keep the peace. But when you no longer give them emotional access, the source of control they depended on begins to disappear. That is often when their most desperate and carefully planned behaviors begin to appear, because losing your emotional attention feels far more frightening to them than losing the relationship itself. Don't miss what comes next, because understanding that final strategy may completely change the way you see their actions forever. They can use your compassion and your natural desire to understand others, but they struggle when facing someone who stays calm, emotionally balanced, and no longer feels the need to react. The moment you stop engaging, the familiar strategies they relied on begin losing their power. When you no longer feel the need to explain yourself, defend every accusation, or endlessly search for closure, the story they have been controlling starts to fall apart. Your silence becomes stronger than any argument you could ever make. The moment they realize their influence is fading is often the exact moment fear begins to grow inside them. Stay with me, because what happens next explains why so many people get pulled back just as they are finally breaking free. This is also why their final strategy can be incredibly dangerous. It often appears at the very moment you are beginning to heal. You finally see the relationship with clearer eyes. You recognize the unhealthy patterns. You rebuild your confidence, strengthen your personal boundaries, and reconnect with your emotional stability. A narcissistic person often notices this shift surprisingly quickly. They recognize when you stop reacting on impulse. They notice when calm thinking begins replacing emotional chaos. They can sense when your peace is no longer tied to their behavior. That is when they make one last effort to regain control. It is usually not loud or dramatic. In fact, it is often subtle enough to appear completely sincere. Every move is shaped by everything they learned about you during the relationship. They remember the words that once weakened your boundaries. They remember the fears you shared, the dreams you held on to, and the emotional wounds you trusted them enough to reveal. They know what once made you question yourself and what repeatedly pulled you back after every painful experience. Then they use that knowledge with remarkable precision. Maybe they suddenly give you the apology you waited years to hear. Maybe they reveal a vulnerable side that awakens your compassion. They may create an unexpected crisis that makes you feel responsible for helping them. Or they may disappear completely, leaving you wondering if you misunderstood everything from the beginning. These approaches work because they are built around your greatest strengths. They depend on your empathy, your loyalty, your kindness, and your sincere desire to solve problems instead of creating more conflict. Keep watching, because the deeper truth behind this behavior is something most people never recognize until it is too late. One of the most important things to understand is that narcissistic people do not suddenly become different simply because they realize you are leaving. More often, they change the way they present themselves. The manipulation remains exactly the same, but it is wrapped in softer words, gentler behavior, and more convincing emotions. Their real goal is not to heal the relationship. Their goal is to interrupt your healing. They want to stop the progress you worked so hard to achieve. They want to plant doubt back into your mind, weaken the confidence you have rebuilt, and pull you into the emotional uncertainty where they always held the greatest advantage. That is exactly why this final move can be so effective. It rarely feels like manipulation. Instead, it looks almost identical to the person you spent so many months or years hoping they would finally become. For a brief moment, it seems as if they truly understand the pain they caused. It feels like personal growth. It looks like accountability. It appears to be the breakthrough you spent so long waiting to see. But underneath that convincing appearance is something very different. This is not true emotional transformation. It is not lasting personal growth. It is a carefully planned attempt to pull you back into a relationship where they once controlled the emotional balance. The purpose is not to rebuild trust. The purpose is to regain control. The timing is almost never random. These behaviors usually appear after you stop reacting, stop chasing, and begin reclaiming your emotional independence. The instant they realize you are no longer emotionally available, they start looking for any opening that could reconnect you to the same unhealthy cycle. They understand that once your emotional freedom becomes stronger than your emotional attachment, their influence begins to disappear. That is why they often become more attentive, more affectionate, or more emotionally expressive than they have been in a very long time. They may suddenly say everything you wished they had said months earlier. They may promise lasting change, speak about a future together, admit mistakes they once denied, or show a level of vulnerability that seems completely different from the person you remember. At first, it can feel genuine because it matches everything you hoped to hear. But lasting change is measured by consistent actions over time, not by emotional words spoken during a moment of panic. Real growth takes patience, accountability, and sustained effort. Manipulation, however, often appears suddenly when control begins slipping away. That is why it is so important to pay attention not only to what they say, but also to why they are saying it now. Don't miss what comes next, because recognizing that difference may be the very thing that protects your peace and keeps you from repeating the same painful cycle again. That is exactly why so many people never realize what is really happening. The moment you emotionally detach, the entire balance of the relationship begins to change. For perhaps the first time, the narcissistic person is no longer controlling the emotional atmosphere. They are no longer directing every conversation, shaping every decision, or deciding how you feel from one day to the next. Your calm becomes deeply unsettling to them. Your silence speaks louder than any argument ever could. Your lack of urgency tells them they no longer have the same influence over your emotions. And because they can no longer predict your reactions with confidence, they begin depending on more carefully planned strategies designed to pull you back into emotional involvement. One of the first roles they often step into is that of the victim. Suddenly, they seem overwhelmed, abandoned, misunderstood, or surrounded by one hardship after another. They may send emotional messages describing how much they are suffering, how difficult life has become, or how painful their past has always been. Every sentence is carefully aimed at awakening your compassion and encouraging you to feel responsible for their emotional well-being. If sympathy does not reopen the door, they quickly switch to another version of themselves. Stay with me, because this next shift explains why so many people begin doubting their own judgment just when they are finally becoming free. Now they become the person who claims they have completely changed. They begin talking about self-improvement, counseling, personal growth, or finally understanding everything you tried to explain throughout the relationship. They start saying exactly what you wished you had heard months or even years earlier. Their words sound convincing, they sound almost perfect. But pay close attention to one important detail. These dramatic realizations appear only after you have already started walking away. The change conveniently arrives at the exact moment they are losing access to you, making it extremely difficult to separate genuine growth from carefully planned strategy. If kindness, vulnerability, and heartfelt promises still fail to draw you back, another mask quickly appears. This time they become defensive, hostile, or openly confrontational. They accuse you of being cold, selfish, uncaring, or heartless. They rewrite the history of the relationship, place all the blame on you, or create unnecessary conflict simply to force another conversation. The specific emotion they trigger is not what matters most, whether it is guilt, anger, fear, frustration, disappointment, or sadness. Every emotional response creates another opportunity for them to regain influence over you. That is why this pattern feels so emotionally exhausting. The constant changes leave you wondering which version of them is real. One day they seem deeply apologetic. The next day they attack you without warning. Then they become vulnerable again, only to turn distant and emotionally cold shortly afterward. That unpredictability keeps your mind searching for answers, hoping the caring version is the real one. Meanwhile, they are often not acting from confusion at all. They are observing your reactions very carefully. They are paying close attention to which emotional approach still affects you. They continue testing every emotional button they discovered during the relationship, hoping one of them still creates the response they want. Keep watching, because understanding this pattern may completely change the way you see every interaction from this point forward. What you are witnessing is usually not evidence of lasting personal change or deep, authentic love. It is control fighting desperately to survive. When you stop caring, the narcissistic person experiences something that feels deeply threatening to the identity they have built. Your emotional independence hurts them far more than arguments or emotional confrontations ever did. As long as you remained emotionally invested, even during conflict, you continued giving them attention, validation, and reassurance that they still mattered in your emotional world. Every explanation you offered, every apology you made, and every attempt to repair the relationship strengthened their sense of importance. But once those emotional reactions disappear, one of their biggest sources of validation disappears with them. That is often when their behavior becomes even more dramatic. Their personality can seem to change completely from one moment to the next. At times, they appear surprisingly gentle, patient, and understanding. A few hours later, they become cold, dismissive, or openly cruel. Then, almost without warning, they present themselves as broken, deeply remorseful, or emotionally overwhelmed, as though they experienced a life-changing awakening overnight. These sudden changes are rarely random emotional outbursts. More often, they are carefully chosen attempts to discover which version of themselves still has the power to reach you. They constantly watch for feedback from you. Every message you send, every response you give, every moment of attention becomes valuable information. They are trying to discover which mask still opens the door to your emotions. They may cry and insist they cannot imagine life without you. They may finally accept responsibility for mistakes they denied for years. They may tell you painful stories about childhood experiences or unresolved emotional wounds, hoping your empathy becomes stronger than the boundaries you fought so hard to build. If compassion still does not work, they often increase the pressure. They may become harsher, more accusing, emotionally distant, or intentionally shocking in their words and actions. Their main objective is to disturb your emotional stability because uncertainty weakens confidence. And someone who feels confused is always easier to influence than someone who remains calm, grounded, and certain of their own reality. That is why protecting your peace becomes one of the most powerful decisions you can make. Once you stop reacting and refuse to step back into the cycle, the control they once depended on begins to fade. And that is the very outcome they fear the most. Don't miss what comes next, because the final stage reveals why staying emotionally grounded is often the strongest response you can ever give. These emotional highs and lows are so powerful because they reach the deepest parts of your heart. They target your compassion, your hope, your loyalty, and your belief that people are capable of real change. Before long, you may begin questioning everything you thought you knew. You wonder if this time they are finally being honest. Maybe they have truly changed. Maybe you are walking away at the very moment they are becoming the person you always hoped they could be. That uncertainty does not happen by accident. It is exactly the emotional state they wanted to create. The constant movement between affection and hostility is rarely random. It is a series of carefully chosen attempts to discover which emotional response still reaches you. Every change in behavior becomes another test of your boundaries, because what they truly want is not mutual understanding. They want access to your emotions again. They are not searching for a healthy relationship. They are trying to regain control. Emotional inconsistency becomes one of the strongest tools they have. The confusion it creates makes you question your instincts, doubt your memories, and rethink decisions that once felt certain and final. The moment confusion enters your mind, the door they have been trying to reopen begins to unlock. Stay with me, because understanding this next part can protect you from falling back into the same painful cycle. Once you recognize this pattern, everything begins to look completely different. Their dramatic personality changes are not proof of deep love or lasting emotional growth. They are signs of growing panic. When a narcissistic person realizes you are moving beyond their emotional reach, the manipulation does not become softer. It becomes more refined, more intentional, and more carefully planned. Their main priority is not repairing the relationship. Their goal is to regain influence over your life. They want to return you to the familiar cycle where they control the emotional atmosphere, where your mood depends on their approval, and where your energy is spent managing their reactions instead of protecting your own peace. What frightens them most is not simply your absence. It is losing the power they once believed they had over your thoughts, your emotions, and your decisions. At this stage, their behavior often becomes surprisingly strategic. They begin recreating situations that once made you feel emotionally close to them. They bring up treasured memories, private conversations, meaningful places, or inside jokes that remind you of happier moments you shared together. They understand how powerful nostalgia can be, so they use it with purpose. If those memories do not weaken your resolve, they often turn to guilt instead. Suddenly, you are reminded of everything they claim they sacrificed for you. They highlight moments when they supported you, stood beside you, or insisted they loved you without conditions. Those memories may be exaggerated, carefully selected, or completely rewritten, but the purpose never changes. They want you questioning the boundaries you worked so hard to build. Guilt becomes one of the strongest emotional anchors they can use because compassionate people naturally struggle with the idea of causing pain to someone else, even someone who repeatedly caused pain to them. Keep watching, because the next strategy is often even more difficult to recognize. If guilt still fails to reopen the connection, another approach usually appears: fear. Sometimes it is obvious, and other times it is so subtle that you barely notice it. They hint that they are falling apart without you. They suggest that you are the only person who has ever truly understood them. They imply that something terrible might happen if you continue walking away. The message is always the same beneath the surface. They want you to believe that you are responsible for keeping them emotionally stable. Ironically, this expectation often comes from someone who rarely accepted responsibility for the emotional pain they caused you. What makes these strategies especially dangerous is how carefully they are disguised. They almost never look like manipulation. Instead, they appear as genuine vulnerability. They sound like honesty. They arrive as emotional emergencies that seem to demand your immediate attention. They create situations that make you feel needed once again. For someone who has spent years loving deeply, forgiving repeatedly, or trying to rescue others, that feeling can be incredibly difficult to resist. But beneath the surface, the objective remains exactly the same. They are trying to interrupt your healing before it becomes permanent. They notice your confidence returning. They recognize that clarity is replacing confusion. They can sense your boundaries growing stronger and your self-worth becoming healthier every day. They also understand something very important. If they cannot break that progress now, they may never regain the influence they once had over your life. That is why the manipulation often becomes much stronger during this stage. It is not because their love has suddenly become deeper. It is because their fear has become greater. The emotional chaos they create is not accidental. It is one final attempt to stop you from leaving with your confidence, your peace, and your emotional freedom fully intact. And once you understand that truth, their actions become much easier to recognize for what they really are. Instead of seeing love, you begin seeing patterns. Instead of reacting emotionally, you begin responding with wisdom. That shift changes everything, because the greatest power you can take back is the ability to protect your peace without feeling guilty for doing so. And when you refuse to step back into the cycle, you remove the control they depended on for so long. That is the moment real healing begins, and it is also the moment they realize they can no longer reach you in the way they once could.